This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, that's all you need to know about me, and this is the podcast returning after a brief summer break. So thank you for coming back. If you're a regular listener, welcome. If you're new, either way, everyone's welcome, and I hugely appreciate your eardrums. The aim of this podcast, if you are new to it, is, well, the title gives it away. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I talk about development stories, production stories, behind the scenes stories, release stories, marketing stories, all those bits and bobs that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films that I cover in every episode, they tend to have a mainstream leaning to them. They're films I have some degree of interest in. I'm not interested in punching down. I'm not interested in snark. I just think it's such an achievement to get a film made and into cinemas. And this podcast really, if anything, is a celebration of that. I cover 2 films per episode. I've waffled on far too much already. So I'm going to transport you back to 2005 and play you a clip from the first of the 2 movies I'm about to talk about.
That is so weird. The wind is blowing toward the storm. It's okay. Lightning doesn't strike twice.
Where's the thunder?
Robbie, you saw the lightning?
Yeah, 26 times on Lincoln Avenue.
You feel that?
That then was a clip from the trailer from 2005's War of the Worlds, directed by Steven Spielberg, screenplay by Josh Friedman and David Koepp, based on the novel, of course, by H.G. Wells. The cast led by Tom Cruise, along with Dakota Fanning, Miranda Otto, Justin Chatwin and Tim Robbins. It's actually quite a contained core cast for this particular movie. A huge blockbuster in the middle of the 2000s then, but the first, it's one that came together spectacularly quickly, not least given the scale of the project. That the first mention I can find anywhere of the film is in, I found it in an issue of Film Review magazine back in its July 2002 issue, where the film Minority Report, which I'm coming to on a future Film Stories, was being discussed. And there's just a news story in there that just happened to mention that Tom Cruise was interested in producing a new take on H.G. Wells' book, and that it was pushing through his company, Cruise Wagner Productions, and that was pretty much it. No one else involved at that point. Now, Minority Report, of course, brought Tom Cruise and Steven Spielberg together for the first time. Really successful film, really good film as well. The pair were keen to work together again, though. And so they went off and did their separate projects once Minority Report was in the can. Cruise would go and make The Last Samurai with Ed Zwick, for instance. He would also do Collateral with Michael Mann. In terms of Spielberg, he would go and do Catch Me If You Can, and he would also do The Terminal with Tom Hanks. But it was while Spielberg was making Catch Me If You Can that Cruise went and visited him on the set of that film. Now, Cruise at that point was developing Mission Impossible 3 as well, but he went to Spielberg, and as the story goes, he suggested to the director 3 possible films that they could each do together. Now, the identity of the first 2 of those films was never revealed, and given that Cruise and Spielberg haven't made a big blockbuster together since, maybe we'll never find out. But the third on the list that Cruise presented to Spielberg was War of the Worlds, and Spielberg was quickly in. As Cruise recalled in an interview, he said, "We looked at each other and the lights went on. As soon as I heard it, I said, oh my God, War of the Worlds, absolutely, that was it." Now, Spielberg was not only a fan of the book, but also the infamous Orson Welles radio production of it. It's well worth looking up the story of that if you've not seen it. Remember Empire magazine giving away a cassette of it. And again, I think it's out there and it's well worth tracking down. But Spielberg also loved the 1953 film adaptation starring George Pal and Brian Haskin, and the pair would ultimately be invited to take cameos in the new film. There was a story as well, I couldn't find much validation for it, but I just thought it was worth putting in just for a bit of colour, that Spielberg had been toying with a version of War of the Worlds before, but it was the release of the film Independence Day in the mid-90s, directed by Roland Emmerich, that changed his plan, and he kind of left that alone. Now, another story that there's not an awful lot of sources for, but there's a suggestion that J.J. Abrams, who then was high off the back of the TV show Alias, was approached about doing the screenplay, but he was developing a TV show called Lost. And I mention this because we're coming to Abrams and Lost again very shortly. David Koepp had worked with Spielberg as the screenwriter of Jurassic Park, as one of the screenwriters of Jurassic Park, and he was approached to put together a screenplay for War of the Worlds. Now, the brief for this one was to do a contemporary take on the story. That the feeling was they wanted it to be, and a lot of this came from Spielberg as well as Koepp, that they wanted it to be a small story in the midst of an alien invasion. And Koepp was free to go off and fairly freely write his first draft, and the idea was to zero in on the character of Ray, ultimately played by Tom Cruise, and to make this a small family story in the midst of a massive alien invasion. They were clear what they didn't want to do. They didn't want to do a film with huge monuments toppling, with recognisable landmarks falling to the ground. They didn't want to do a film that constantly cut back to cable news stories to help progress the narrative. In fact, the one instance of a cable news report that's used in the film, they turned the television off, and that was a pointed, deliberate choice. Instead, they figured if they make it a family story at its heart, they could just avoid a lot of the conventions of big alien invasion movies. And I wonder to a degree if there's a little bit of an anti-reaction to the kind of films that Michael Bay and Roland Emmerich had been making. It was a top secret project. It's worth noting that. And that's going to come into play when I come to the Paramount bit of the story in a second. But just to give the flavour of that, Koepp told IGN in an interview that Spielberg wouldn't give the screenplay to anybody, that Koepp would email it to him, he'd give a section of the script that was relating to whatever somebody was doing, and that was it. And only 5 people read the whole script. Over at Paramount Pictures, meanwhile, the pressure was building because it thought it had Tom Cruise tied down to do Mission Impossible 3 for the summer of 2005. Moreover, it needed Tom Cruise to do Mission Impossible 3 for the summer of 2005 because that was the studio's big tentpole production. I've referred to this book a couple of times in the podcast. I do recommend digging it out. It's a book called Leading Lady, Sherry Lansing and the Making of Hollywood Groundbreaker by Stephen Galloway. And this is a book, effectively it's an authorised biography of Lansing, who was heading Paramount Pictures at the time, and that's where you get the detail of the story of Mission Impossible 3 and War of the Worlds from the studio side. So Tom Cruise had been umming and ahhing about which director he wanted for Mission Impossible 3, and he settled on a director by the name of, J.J. Abrams. And this was not J.J. Abrams of Star Trek and Star Wars, even Super 8 end of his career. J.J. Abrams had not directed a feature film. More to the point, at that stage, he'd had huge success off the back of Alias, which is one of the projects that Cruise was alerted to him over, but he was developing this TV series Lost that he was going to direct the pilot of. Now, such was the level of confidence that Tom Cruise had in J.J. Abrams that he suggested pausing Mission Impossible 3 to wait for him to be available. The world's biggest movie star was going to wait for a novice movie director. And it's worth just highlighting just what an anomaly that was. This left Paramount with an enormous problem, that Sherry Lansing couldn't really boss Tom Cruise around. He was the golden goose for the studio, really. And so what she did is she called Michael Eisner, then the head of Disney, who Disney owns ABC, that was developing Lost. And Lansing asked Eisner if they could have J.J. Abrams early, if they could be a juggle round of projects. No dice. Eisner said no, that the lost set schedule was locked, and so Lansing instead, she tried leaning on Cruise, and she tried putting across to him that Mission Impossible 3 needed to be ready for 2005. She said the franchise will grow old, and the audience will get tired of it. Cruise disagreed. Lansing said meet some of the other directors, but Cruise wouldn't. He wanted to wait for J. Abrams, to the point where Lansing says she lost it and said, you're going to be too old to do it in 2 years, given that Cruise is now making 2 Mission Impossible films in his late 50s. I think that's long been disproved, as Lansing concedes. But she said, he was 42 when she said this to him, and Cruise just smiled and said, you think so? That's him. The meeting with Cruise ended without that summer blockbuster, with Mission Impossible now pushed likely to the summer of 2006, possibly longer, given that Abrams at that point wanted to completely rewrite the script. But Lansing then tells the story of how she had subsequent meetings with Cruise over the following weeks, and that there would be a steady rhythm to them, and she would describe it as Tom would look at me and say, you seem so depressed, and I'd say, well, I am, and he'd take my hand and put his own over it and say, Sherry, you're like my sister, trust me, you know I'd never hurt you. And every time we met, Lansing said the same thing. But if Cruise had confidence in what was happening, Lansing at that stage didn't. She had this gap in the schedule that she knew the trade press would devour as soon as it became clear. So she started ringing round. She went through her contacts book. She rang other studio heads to see if there were blockbuster films that they could co-finance, that Paramount could come in and partner on. And she didn't. She had around less than a year, to find a massive film for the July the 4th, 2005 date that it had earmarked. And eventually she resigned herself to the fact this is not going to happen, that she was going to have to put the announcement out, that Paramount was going to be widely ridiculed, and it would not be a good day. And then Steven Spielberg called. And Spielberg said to Lansing that, you know, Tom and I have been working on this project, War of the Worlds. We've got a script. We'd like you to read it. And Lansing, of course, said, yes, there's Spielberg on the phone. She'd made Saving Private Ryan with him. Sure. And she read the script and she loved the script. And Spielberg was offering it as a joint venture with his DreamWorks company. Lansing read it. Yeah, no question she was going to be in. But this was going to take a while to make. And she suspected, and this conversation was taking place in the summer of 2004, she suspected it would take until 2007 before the film would be ready. So she rang Spielberg and said, what date did you have in mind? And he said, July the 4th. And she said, July the 4th, 2006. And he said, no, July the 4th, 2005. This film was nearly ready to go. Tom Cruise had known this all along. Sherry Lansing, metaphorically, bit their arm off. She had her massive summer blockbuster. War of the Worlds, this top secret project, was suddenly going ahead. The problem was, heck, were they up against the clock. That whilst in that original development there was a feeling that a 2007 release date was more likely, the film was greenlit in the middle of August 2004 for a July 2005 release. That is an insane schedule. It was afforded to them by the fact that Cruise was available because Mission Impossible 3 was going back a year. Spielberg was available. He was going to make Munich straight afterwards, but he had the gap in the schedule. So Spielberg spoke to his longtime producer Kathleen Kennedy and said, we're going to make this movie, we're going to need to prep it quickly, we're going to start shooting in 3 months. And Kennedy was not unreasonably thinking a little bit WTF on that, but Spielberg assured her, don't freak out when you look at the script, just recognise there are 3 people in the movie, that's the heart of the film, and every now and then 1,000 people are running around in the background. As much of the film was a three-hander, it's a very broad canvas three-hander, and thus in the autumn of 2004 production teams were set up simultaneously on both coasts of America, the east and west coast, to prepare for the start date of the movie. They were scoping out locations, they were building the sets, they were preparing the sound stages, they were doing some pre-vis work which I'll come to shortly, and basically work that may have taken place in a kind of more logical order was now that there was an awful lot of multitasking going on to get this film together. On the casting side, it's just worth touching on one or two names in there. I mean, Tom Cruise was the initiator, effectively, of the project, so inevitably he took on the lead role. Dakota Fanning, at this stage, at the time of the film's release, I think she was 10 or 11 years old, and she was quickly on Spielberg's list to play Cruise's daughter in the film, Rachel. Fanning had worked with Spielberg on the miniseries Taken, not based on the Liam Neeson series of films, I should note. She'd appeared on film in The Cat in the Hat, and Spielberg was aware of her and was keen to cast her in the film. In terms of the role of Robbie, Cruise's son in the film, well, Justin Chatwin had come to the attention of the production team off the back of the little seen and deserves to be more seen independent movie Chum Scrubber. Miranda Otto, meanwhile, well, she was in the ensemble in the role of Cruise's ex-wife in the movie, Mary Ann, and so she, at the point she was being cast, there was a problem in that she was offered the role, but she feared she wouldn't be able to take it because she was pregnant at the time. However, Spielberg, upon learning this, just decided, let's work the pregnancy into the story, and that's why the character Mary Ann, and she's only one or two scenes in the film, but it's significant one or two scenes, that's why she's pregnant, and it was both accommodating Miranda Otto's real-life pregnancy, but also enhancing the character somewhat. The character of Ogilvy is played in the film by Tim Robbins, and it was a part of the book I'm going as spoiler light as I can. It's a part of the book that takes place in a basement that David Koepp was particularly keen to zero in on in terms of going against the conventions of what a big massive movie of this ilk should be, in that one of its smallest, most compact sequences takes place right near the end of the film. And thus, as a consequence, they had this character Ogilvy who wasn't going to be on screen for an awful long time, and they needed an actor who could quickly embody what this character was about. Bill Murray was reportedly high on the list, but he was committed to making The Life Aquatic with director Wes Anderson at the time, and thus Tim Robbins was fairly high on the list as well. He was happy to come on board, knew that the character didn't have an awful lot of screen time and needed to make an impact in the space that the character afforded. Spielberg, while the casting was going on, and Spielberg and his team were doing a lot of preparation work, and Spielberg had been talking to his old chum George Lucas about the pre-visualization techniques that Lucas had used on his Star Wars prequels. Lucas at that point was working on Revenge of the Sith. And whilst Spielberg had traditionally storyboarded his films, this time, for the first time, he used a full pre-visualization for the visual effects in the movie. This was crucial given the size of some of the scenes, and affording the actors the knowledge of knowing where the effects were, where they were, because it's all woven in particularly well in the final cut of the movie. There were in all more than 500 CG effect shots that were going to be needed throughout the film, and these were having to be built as the film was shooting. And so appreciating that production only started the 72-day shoot of the film, I mean, that's worth considering as well, given what they put on screen. Production only started on this movie, the cameras were rolling, on the 8th of November 2004. We're wrapping up on the 7th of March 2005. That's when the last shot was in the can. Spielberg and his team scheduled the big action scenes for the early stages of shooting. I mean, there's an interesting contrast with the first two Harry Potter films, both of which were directed by Chris Columbus, in that one of the things he said with that was when he came to do the second Harry Potter film, Columbus scheduled all the big effect stuff for early on, because one of the reasons the effects in the first Harry Potter film didn't quite pass muster was a lot of those big sequences were shot towards the end of the production. They couldn't take that kind of gamble with War of the Worlds. They did those big sequences really early so that the effects team, Dennis Muren as part of it, were able to start building those sequences up in post-production while production was going on. The location, I mean, the film was primarily sited across two studio lots, so Fox and Universal, but also they used 24 locations across 5 states. And as a consequence, the 72-day shoot was even more incredible, given the amount of travel in there. As David David Koepp would tell IGN, Spielberg is the only one who can do it in terms of the price he does it for. I mean, it's really an affordable movie for what happens in it. And part and parcel of that is the fact that Spielberg moves fast. He doesn't mess around. When he's making a movie, he's making a movie. The movie, I mean, it's worth noting, would cost $132 million is the given budget figure for it. That was slightly more expensive than Revenge of the Sith, but also cheaper than that year's Batman reboot, Batman Begins, directed, of course, by Christopher Nolan, and only a little bit more expensive than the star-laden Mr. and Mrs. Smith. It's worth noting that a good deal of the cost of War of the Worlds as well it had Tom Cruise in it. It had Steven Spielberg involved. These were not cheap people to get involved, even though a good chunk of their money came from the back end of the film. There was a lot of physicality to the production. For instance, there's a sequence that takes place with people fleeing cars, etc. A really long held shot in there, and that was all built on a soundstage rather than being done on location. But it was done with a lot of extras on a set. There wasn't cheating there. There's a moment in the film too where there's a crashed plane, and in much the same way that Christopher Nolan has apparently recently done with Tenet, they just got an old plane. They got hold of a out-of-use Boeing 747, and then once they were done with the filming of it, they just added the crashed Boeing 747 to the Universal tour in Hollywood. One further story I found on this one was the fact that some extras were were given makeup that made it look like they were really badly wounded, that lots of bleeding and burns, and that their flesh was being melted. And this was cut back. Because one of the things that inevitably the film was targeting was a PG-13 rating. And if you go back to Spielberg's Jurassic Park in 1993, that was notable in the UK for getting a PG certificate, and it got it because there was no blood. And so one of the things that Spielberg in his films has always been very keenly aware of is when to cut back on the gore, when to cut back on the pain impact in order to secure a family-friendly certificate, which he duly got for War of the Worlds. I would suggest this is quite a melancholy film in the Spielberg canon of movies, and probably not as family friendly as most of his movies, but nonetheless it was able to go out to the broadest possible audience. Even as the film headed into post-production, though, there was a veil of secrecy over it, that this is one of the most secretive productions that Steven Spielberg had been involved with. They were playing their cards very, very close to their chest at on this one, even though it was based on a very well-known book, although like a lot of very well-known books, it's questionable just how many people have actually read it. I must confess, I've never read H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, although I have seen an assortment of versions of it. Nonetheless, the film was ready for its premiere. No small achievement this. It was ready for its premiere on June the 23rd, 2005. Ahead of its release in the US, which had moved forward from that July the 4th date, it now came out on June the 29th, 2005 in America, in time for that Independence Day weekend. And what a huge hit the movie was. That the reviews for the movie were certainly quite mixed. I remember when I went to see it for the first time thinking it was a little bit of a compilation album to a degree of things I'd seen in other Spielberg films. Now that's what I call Spielberg, if you like. Although revisiting it ahead of this podcast, I see more in it than I certainly did at that point. I don't think it's top grade Spielberg, but I do think it's an interesting movie, and certainly the fact that it inverses a lot of the alien invasion conventions, that's quite interesting as well. All that discussion, though, made little difference to the box office. The film opened with $64 million at the box office. In fact, over the 4-day weekend that it opened, it grossed, it added $77 million for a total gross inside its first 5 or 6 days of $112 million in the US. To put that into some degree of context, it knocked Batman Begins, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, Bewitched, Herbie Fully Loaded, Madagascar, Rebound. That was in there, and that's not a film many people talk about. Star Wars was in the mix as well. The Longest Yard, Land of the Dead rounded out the top 10 of the week of War of the Worlds' release. It wasn't just in the US where the film was a sizable hit as well. It was a substantive hit overseas. That in America the movie would ultimately gross $234 million, but internationally it it would take in another 369. Total worldwide gross for this one, 603 million. It's worth noting, outside of franchises, this is one of Spielberg's biggest films at the US box office. It came in under 2 hours as well, and it would ultimately attract the interest of the Oscars as well, that it would pick up a trio of Academy Award nominations, albeit in technical categories, although it would prevail with none of them. In terms of where they went next, Cruise would go on and do Mission Impossible 3 with J.J. Abrams the year after it would be released, although the box office of Mission Impossible 3 was always said to be impacted, I have covered it before on Film Stories, always said to be impacted by an infamous interview that Tom Cruise gave around the time with Oprah Winfrey. Spielberg would go on to make one of his darkest films, not the darkest, but one of his darkest films, with Munich, that he would go pretty much straight onto that. And then once he was done with Munich, a couple of years off before Indiana Jones, The Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, and that is definitely a story for another time. Cruise and Spielberg wouldn't, at least to date, work together again. There was some tittle-tattle around the time of the film's release that there'd been a little bit of discomfort between the two, that something wasn't quite right. Whether there was much to that or not, I don't know. But the fact remains that they made 2 science fiction films together, 2 big hit science fiction films together. Who knows, perhaps one day they'll make a third. And that brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. Well, first of all, thank you for coming back after I took a couple of weeks away. If you like this podcast, I remain an independent podcast producer, an independent publisher of things. I don't have a big company behind me. I'd be hugely appreciative if you could subscribe to the podcast at your podcast home of choice. If you can leave, ideally, a hugely positive review as well. That really does help enormously with the assorted algorithms and helps this podcast appear above the charts of rich and famous people, although there's some very good rich and famous people. So anything you can do along those lines is hugely appreciated. I also publish print magazines. I do Film Stories magazine, which is a monthly film magazine, the latest issue of which has Brian Blessed on the front cover and a huge interview with the man, and a very sweary interview with the man as well. There's an awful lot in the new issue. I'm really proud of it. That's shipping now, as is the latest issue of the world's only regular-ish film print magazine for under 15s, Film Stories Junior. Issue 4 of that is on sale as well. And again, I mean, that's primarily written by under 15s too. Again, I'm hugely proud of it. If you can support them in any way, either by picking up a copy or spreading the word, that's hugely appreciated. The store website is store.filmstories.co.uk. I think it's probably time, though, after all that hard selling waffle, I'm not very good at that, to crack on with the second of the 2 films I'm going to talk about in this episode of Film Stories. I'm going to play you a bit of a musical number from a movie, a comic book movie, no less, that came out in 1994. I'm going to hand you over to Jim Carrey.
They call me Cuban Pete. I'm the king of the rumba beat. When I play the maracas, I go chick, chicky, boom, chick, chicky, boom. Yes, sir, I'm Cuban Pete. I'm the craze of my naked street. When I start to dance, everything goes chick, chicky, boom, chick, chicky, boom. The senoritas, they sing and they swing with their romero. It's very nice, so full of fun. And when they're dancing, they bring a happy ring that I quero. Singing a song all the day long. If you like the beat, take a lesson from Cuban Pete, and that teach you to chick.
That then was the Cuban Pete song and dance number from 1994's The Mask, directed by Chuck Russell, credited as Charles Russell. Screenplay for this one, well, the final script was written by Mike Werb, and the story credit goes to Michael Fallon and Mark Verheiden. Jim Carrey took on the lead role of Stanley Ipkiss and The Mask. Also in the ensemble for this one, Cameron Diaz, Peter Riegert, Peter Green, Amy Yazbek in there as well. But the origins of the mask go back to Dark Horse Comics and a comic strip a character that was invented in the 1980s. Now, the origins go back there, but the actual the mask wouldn't get his own full comic books until the early 90s. But by that stage, Mike Richardson, who created the character, well, he had the idea of this possibly being a movie character. Thus, along with Todd Moyer, also of Dark Horse, by the end of the 90s, they were mulling this film version of it, and they'd had some interest. They'd had a couple of studios sniffing around. In 1989, of course, Warner Brothers had shown just what you could do with a comic book movie with Batman, directed by Tim Burton, which was a gigantic hit. Disney was in production on Dick Tracy for the following year. The expectation at that stage was Dick Tracy was going to be a gigantic hit. I've covered that in a previous film stories. So Warner Brothers, for one, was interested in picking up the mask. Ironically, it would ultimately own it by picking up the company that made it, and that company was New Line Pictures. Now, at the end of the 1980s, the start of the 1990s, New Line was a fully independent film company. It went to Dark Horse, it went to Mike Richardson and Todd Moyer, and said that it not only wanted the film, but it would guarantee they would make it. Warner Brothers couldn't and wouldn't offer a similar guarantee, and thus they went with New Line, and the deal was struck. And at the time the deal was struck for them to bring the mask to the big screen, the actual comic book character was much darker and far more violent than the version we actually got on screen in the end. New Line had originally wanted the movie for 1991, and at this stage the company, as Richardson would tell the Los Angeles Times, was in the midst of its Nightmare on Elm Street phase. That was the franchise that really powered New Line in its early years, that it was horror that had given the studio its success, and thus the mask fitted that. And so the idea of making a horror franchise out of the mask was very prevalent in its mind. But it was the Dark Horse team that wanted something else, because it was evolving this character of Stanley Ipkiss and the mask. And more they wanted the main character to be a bit more like Tex Avery, to have more of a Looney Tunes inflection to it. As a consequence, the film stumbled around in development for a bit. That New Line was still committed to make it, but it wasn't going to be made in 2 years, and it wasn't going to be coming out in 1991. The character and tone of the mask ultimately changed as a consequence during that period of time. Now, New Line was still seeking out personnel. This was still a film in some degree of active development, and in particular, it had a director in mind. It had worked with Chuck Russell on the third and one of the most popular Nightmare on Elm Street films, The Dream Warriors. Russell had also done another horror-tinged film, The Blob, and so he seemed a fairly logical hire. They knew him, and he knew his way around horror. But Russell himself wasn't looking for a horror film at that point. He'd produced the Rodney Dangerfield headlined Back to School, and so he was keen as well to avoid being pigeonholed. And so when he became aware of the mask, he saw something a bit different in it. Now, he was interested in getting involved, but in 1990 a screenplay had been put together which was more horror driven. But it was also around that time that screenwriter Mark Verheiden came on board, and he was a friend of Mike Richardson, and so Richardson asked him to write a script, and as Verheiden would tell Starlog, he wrote the second draft of the film, that he spent a lot of his time tuning the characters and adding a lot more comedy to it, and also the infamous Cuban Pete number that I played earlier that I'm going to be coming to again a little bit later down the story. Now, Verheiden just wrote one draft of the script, and it was reworked subsequent to his involvement in there, and it would change quite a bit, but bits and bobs that he injected into it remain in the final cut of the film. Verheiden had approached the writing of his second draft with some caution as to what technology could do, because they had this fairly dramatic idea of this character who would basically turn into a cartoon character. And okay, Who Framed Roger Rabbit had come along a few years before, but that had been a hugely technical demanding production. And visual effects at 1990, well, Terminator 2 hadn't happened at this point, Jurassic Park hadn't happened at this point. Could a computer really realise the ideas that were in Verheiden's head? But Richardson just said to him, let us worry about that, effectively. You write what you think this film should be, we'll sort the rest of it out later. And as it would turn out, the various delays to the film, which wouldn't come out until 1994, would work in its favour because it gave technology the chance to catch up. The next version of the script, ultimately the final version of the script, was done by Mike Werb. Now, I've talked about him previously on the Film Stories podcast when I discussed Face Off, and in that particular episode I quoted an interview that Werb did with blog critics, and in the same interview he just revealed a couple of things about The Mask, that he would base the character of Stanley Ipkiss a little bit more on himself, but also that he wrote his own first draft of The Mask in less than 6 weeks. And less than 2 months later, the film was greenlit. That he, between them all, they'd unlocked what this film should be, and it was time to move forward with it. I have, of course, skipped a little bit of the story here, though, because there's the small matter of the casting of the film. Now, all sorts of casting rumours were around, that, and this was not a high-profile project. It's worth noting that in in the early 1990s, barely anyone had heard of The Mask. Dark Horse Comics wasn't a big name, and this was going to be a fairly modestly costed film from a non-Hollywood major studio. So whilst names such as Matthew Broderick and Rick Moranis and Martin Short and Steve Martin were in the mix for the role of Stanley Ipkiss, it was an unknown who ultimately took on the lead role, and it was an unknown for whom this was set to be his first lead movie. It was, of course, a pre-fame Jim Carrey. Now, he'd been in films. He'd done the Deadpool, the Last Dirty Harry movie, for instance. He had a little role in that. He'd done the TV show In Living Colour. He'd been in Earth Girls Are Easy. And he'd come to the attention of Chuck Russell. And it was off the back of the TV show In Living Colour. And Russell was incredibly keen to cast Carrey in the movie. In fact, he was keen that this was Carrey's first film, but with all the delays that took place and the development delays, it afforded Carrey the time to go off and make a little film that would be his leading man debut in cinema, called Ace Ventura: Pet Detective. And who's heard of that? Definitely not coming back to that later in the story. Carrey thus signed on the dotted line for a price of $450,000. I think it's fair to say it is the last film he would make for a price that low. I think every film he's made since has had at least one more zero in that. It was Russell who really pushed for him. As he said in an interview a couple of years ago with the Hollywood News website, well worth checking out that site, he said, "I just said to this studio, we have to get this guy Jim Carrey for the role and make this a comedy." And he said, at that point, New Line thought I was off my rocker, and then I didn't hear back from them for about a year. When they eventually came back to me, they said, "Tell me how this story about a guy, a girl and a dog in a nightclub will work." And so Russell said, so then I completely changed the script and adapted it into a comedy rather than a horror. The dog, Milo, incidentally, was a new character invented for the movie. That it was Werb who came in and retooled the screenplay off the back of this change towards a comedy, and also retooled it once Jim Carrey had been cast. And when Russell gave Carrey the script for the film, Carrey said, "I feel this was written for me," and ultimately it would be written for him. Now, it's a pretty well-known story that Carrey's physical comedy flexibility shaved cash off the effects budget for The Mask, that he was able to do things in camera that meant when the effects work was being done at ILM, it saved some labour and cash on their part. But it was still going to be tight. This was not a big budget film. I think the ultimate cost of it was, $23 million. And as Mike Werb said in that aforementioned interview with blog critics, there were a lot of VFX scenes that had to be cut for budget. One of them that was potentially up to be cut was the Milo the dog sequence, but ultimately the dog was left in. It helped the ending of the movie. But and Chuck Russell, in fact, told Werb, as he would say in this interview, that the folks at ILM were fighting over who got to animate the dog that Werb had invented for this movie. The other major piece of casting for the film, of course, was an unknown at the time, another unknown at the time, called Cameron Diaz. And she was working in modelling at the time. And in the end, she would do around a dozen auditions to land the role of Tina Carlisle in the movie. Russell really had to fight for her because he wanted to cast in the co-lead role in the movie, basically on paper, a model with no acting experience. Russell was so insistent on having her, goes the story, that he threatened not to do the film if he couldn't cast her in the movie, and ultimately Cameron Diaz signed up for The Mask, in part off the back of his insistence. Russell did have a secret about it all that he wasn't telling the team at New Line. And that was, he had another view on what this film should be. So not just that it wasn't going to be a horror production, but the fact that it had turned into a comedy, that was well known. But Russell also had his idea on sort of doing it as a musical. And in an article that appeared on Variety celebrating the 25th anniversary of the film, Jerry Evans, who was hired to choreograph the film, recalled the moment where Chuck Russell said to him that he was basically secretly making a musical movie. And Evans said, I said secretly. And Evans said that Russell admitted to him, I haven't told anybody other than you and my producer. We'll just tell everybody when it's time, I guess. And he had a plan, and Evans was well on board with this, said, sounds good to me, I love it. And as a consequence, they started plotting that this was going to be a film with some very big musical numbers in it, as it would ultimately transpire. That said, there was not a lot of time to shoot this film. It had 50 days of physical photography, which when you go back and look at the movie, it's just landed on Netflix UK here in Britain. I mean, it's quite ambitious, really. Just the song and dance sequences are hugely ambitious, with lots of human beings on set. Story goes, the director of The Proposal, Anne Fletcher, was one of the extras in one of the song and dance numbers as well. It's shot in California. It's quite contained between August and October 1993, and Russell had to build into all of this room for his leading man to improvise. That allowing Jim Carrey to go off and try things was going to be a huge part, as it turned out, of the shoot of The Mask. That Carrey would come to the set with new ideas, and Russell would build in the space for Carrey to explore those new ideas. Also on the set right the way through was the team from Industrial Light and Magic, ILM, because of the way that the effects were going to have to be woven in with the live action footage, that this was really early days for computer graphics of this scale in a feature film. And so ILM needed to be there to watch what was happening, to make sure that everything stood a sporting chance of being matched up, that there wasn't an awful lot of flexibility there. Now, one of the things that Russell would say was this is where being part of New Line Cinema was a huge help, and not being part of a big movie studio, because if it had been a movie studio, they'd have had to go through the studio's effects team, who then would have outsourced the work to ILM. But because New Line was smaller, they could just go straight to ILM. They could get the work without, if you like, a middle person price to it, a premium being added to it. But also there was enthusiasm on the part of ILM to make the film as well, because how often does a film like this turn up? Around the time ILM was just in the midst of doing the Star Wars prequels, for instance. It was doing spaceships, it was doing aliens, and then this utterly nutty comedy musical comic book movie with Looney Tunes influences all over it lands on their desk, and they were very, very, very keen to do it, as you might expect. So, the film wrapped up in October of 1993, and the extensive post-production work got underway, and it would take some time to piece all that together. But during that post-production, two notable things happened. First of all, let's go back to that Cuban Pete song, because that was a part of the movie that ended up under significant threat, that the producers of The Mask really weren't keen on it at all, that the secret was out. Russell had injected musical sequences into this movie. They didn't quite know what they were getting, and so when the Cuban Pete sequence was screened, the producers pushed back against it. They just felt it slowed the film down, that it was making the whole thing longer longer. And it's worth noting that The Mask isn't a long film in the first place. It comes in at about an hour and a half in all. What saved that sequence was the test screening process. That this was a film that was test screened. The audiences loved the Cuban Pete song and dance number. They loved the musical side of it, and thus all of those stayed safely in the final cut of the movie. However, for all the wonderful work being done by ILM on the film, for all the work done by the editing team, for all the post-production work that was being completed, the biggest impact on The Mask in post-production was Jim Carrey becoming a movie star. That the fact that the film had been delayed to allow Carrey to do Ace Ventura: Pet Detective first really, really heavily played to its favour. The Ace Ventura: Pet Detective, released by Warner Brothers, opened at number one at the US box office, a proper sleeper hit out of nowhere, and Carrey was an overnight comedy sensation. People started looking around for what would he do next, and there's this small company, New Line Cinema, with a film for which they'd paid $450,000 for its leading man, and that leading man has overnight become one of the biggest movie stars on the planet. And in fact, by the time The Mask came into cinemas, New Line had hired Jim Carrey to make another film, Dumb and Dumber, and his price had gone up even before The Mask opened, just off the back of Ace Ventura, to $7 million. It was said too that a sequel clause was built into his contract for The Mask, and I'll come to that shortly. But first, the release of the film, that this was a real hit in the summer of 1994. If we just go to its opening weekend, it came out at the end of July of that year, promptly knocking Forrest Gump off the top of the chart. The other films that were around at the time were the hyper-expensive True Lies, which I've covered before, The Client, The Lion King, I've done that in a previous podcast. Speed was in the top 10 as well. And the hit out of nowhere of that summer was The Mask. And if Jim Carrey was a movie star going into it, he was an even bigger one coming off the back end of the film. By the end of the year, Dumb and Dumber would have opened as well, and Dumb and Dumber would have given Carrey, and it's a record, I don't think it's been beaten since, his third number one film of the year. And here was this actor with his first three leading roles scored three huge number one hits in one calendar year. Understandably then, New Line wanted a sequel, because by the time the final monies for The Mask were totted up, this modest $25 million film had done $119 million in America, $231 million overseas, worldwide take $350 million, and that's before it got to video, and it was a huge video hit as well. This was an immensely profitable movie, and also it was well received by critics as well. That this was probably the best critically received of the three films that Carrey released that year. Carrey, though, when it came to the idea of a sequel, well, there was talk of it in the run-up to the release of the movie, that Mike Werb was said he hadn't begun discussions with New Line or Chuck Russell about The Mask 2, but that the pair were, that Werb and Russell were in line to have first refusal at creating a sequel, and the phrase was, which could begin filming as early as next year, thus in 1995, if the original is a hit. Now, New Line were being quite coy on this, and it was said that Carrey had in his contract that a clause that could have been activated for a sequel. Now, obviously, I can't read Jim Carrey's personal correspondence to check this, but what was clear is that Carrey had suddenly become the golden goose for New Line. It was making Dumb and Dumber with him, and so if Carrey didn't want to do a sequel, what was the point of pushing the world's biggest movie star to do it when you wanted to work with him again? As a consequence, I mean, Carrey would go on and do Ace Ventura: When Nature Calls not long afterwards, but found that a pretty joyless experience, and it made him a very sequel-averse actor. If you go over his career, I mean, he did Batman Forever, but that wasn't really a sequel to him. You have to go a long way before he would do the Dumb and Dumber follow-up. He would also do Kick-Ass 2, but again, that wasn't a sequel to him. His reluctance to do a sequel wasn't helpful, of course. It's a fairly famous story to the publishers of Nintendo Power magazine, who offered in a competition a cameo role in The Mask 2, and the competition was duly won, but when Carrey decided actually he didn't want to do a further Mask film, in its last issue, it apologised, and the winner of that competition was given some cash to kind of fob them off a little bit. As it turned out, another Mask film would follow, but none of them would be involved. That in 2005, New Line pressed ahead with Son of the Mask, with Jamie Kennedy in the lead role. It was not good. And New Line also did a Dumb and Dumber prequel along the same lines, which is called When Harry Met Lloyd. That also was not good. Since then, there has been talk occasionally resurfacing of a new Mask film. There's been the idea of gender flipping it as well. But at the time, I mean, right now, there doesn't seem an awful lot of inclination to press ahead with it. So grounded, really, was it around Carrey's personality when it did come to the big screen. And so what you have with The Mask is pretty much an anomaly in terms of 90s cinema, that you have a huge superhero success, a hugely profitable superhero success, and yet one of the few films, if you go through the box office charts of that era, to enjoy that level of success, that level of profit, to have all the creatives still around, but no sequel in sight. Given the film's current popularity as it bubbles along on Netflix, again at the time of recording, I'd suggest there's probably appetite for it. It's just nobody seems to want to make it. And that brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. You can find more from me at Simon Brew on Twitter. You can find the entire Film Stories project on Twitter at Film Stories Pod. The mighty Dan Cooper is replenishing our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Film Stories with new material there. I also have the Film Stories website, which has daily, every weekday, features and news and lots of nerdy stuff to do with the movies. And that's been building up quite nicely. Huge thanks for your support on that. You can find that at www.filmstories.co.uk, and you can find the full back catalogue of magazines and subscriptions and bits and bobs like that at store.filmstories.co.uk. Facebook too, facebook.com/filmstoriesonline. But I think I've squeezed in enough for one episode there. I'm going to leave you in peace, and thank you as always for your time. The most important thing is you stay safe, you look after yourselves. Thank you so much for coming back and listening to me. Be back soon with another bunch of Film Stories. Bye bye. Oh, hello. You've just found a little post-credits bit in an updated version of this podcast. I've been made aware by Andrew Ellard, the terrific Andrew Ellard, just of a factual inaccuracy that I want to correct. And that's when I talked about War of the Worlds, I talked about how David Koepp was approached to pen the script and to make it modern day. Actually, Josh Friedman was in there first. He wrote the first drafts and was credited, and Koepp came in and did rewrite work. I'm happy to credit that. Thank you happy to correct that, and thank you to Andrew Ellard, who you can find at Ellardent, ELLARDENT on Twitter. He's well worth a follow. Take care. Bye bye.